Hey everyone. It's great to see so many of you here today. I'm so glad that you could join us. My name is Jessica Fredston-Hermann, and here at Overdeck Family Foundation, I lead educator investments within our school success portfolio, which aims to increase the number of kindergarten through eighth grade students demonstrating meaningful growth and proficiency in literacy and math. My portfolio's grant making is really focused on building toward a future where more educators are prepared and supported to improve outcomes for every single student, and more students experience engaging learning aligned with their needs. And that brings me to why we're here. As we look across the country at classrooms today, educators are asked to meet an increasingly diverse range of student needs and grade level abilities. The job has become even more complex, yet many schools are still operating within traditional classroom models that were designed for a very different era. At the same time, we know schools have finite time and limited resources, but they also have tremendous educator expertise underneath the same roof. So the question isn't how to add more within the school day, it's more about how to better utilize what's already available to support educators in better supporting their students. That's why we're excited to convene today's conversation. We'll explore two promising approaches to strengthening the teaching profession while improving outcomes for students. First, we'll examine how AI-enabled professional learning tools and redesigned instructional models can improve teaching and learning by shifting how existing professional learning and instructional time are used. Then we'll turn to strategic staffing models that rethink the traditional one teacher, one classroom paradigm to expand student access to effective teaching while creating new opportunities for educators to grow and lead. Here at Overdeck Family Foundation, we're interested in these approaches, not just because they're new or different, but really because they seek to address long-standing challenges in education with an eye toward improving teaching and learning and ultimately student outcomes. The central question guiding our investments in this work is how can schools redesign the use of time, talent, and technology so educators can spend more of their energy on the work that matters more for students? These approaches are not silver bullets, and today's conversation isn't necessarily about endorsing any one particular model. Instead, we hope today can serve as an opportunity to explore what the evidence tells us, what we're learning from implementation, where key questions remain, and what school and district leaders should consider as they decide what models can drive student outcomes in their communities. With that, let's get started. First, I want to introduce today's fantastic lineup of panelists joining us for our first conversation, exploring ways to redesign the use of tech and time in the classroom. We have Julie Cohen, Charles S. Robb Professor at the University of Virginia's School of Education and Human Development, Kareem Farah, CEO and co-founder of Modern Classrooms Project, Sarah Johnson, CEO of Teaching Lab and Relay Graduate School of Education, and Daisha Toll, co-CEO and co-founder of Course Mojo. In the second half of the hour, we'll shift gears to discuss redesigning the use of talent in the classroom. And for that conversation, we'll feature Bryan Hassel, co-president of Public Impact, Mary Lasky, research assistant professor at Arizona State University's Mary Lou Fulton College for Teaching and Learning Innovation and research principal at the Center on Reinventing Public Education, and Brent Madden, executive director of Arizona State University's Next Education Workforce. You can find more info on each of those organizations in the chat. Before we jump in, a couple of really quick housekeeping items. We saved the last 15 minutes of today's webinar for Q&A. Many of you submitted questions in advance. Thank you. If anything else comes up during the conversation, please put it in the Q&A box along with the specific panelist if you have a particular person in mind. And as a reminder, today's session is being recorded. We'll share a link with everyone who registered after we finish today's webinar. Great. So now I want to welcome our first group of panelists, Julie, Sarah, Daisha, and Kareem. Thank you for being here. One of the things I most admire about this group is how intentional you all are in really grounding every decision in the impact you're trying to create for teachers and students. I have the privilege of finding myself in rooms or on calls where I hear you asking, how will this help improve teaching and learning? So while we'll talk about reimagining use of teachers' time today, I want to lead with that question to keep in mind that our goal is less about being more efficient with time than about being more effective and really equipping educators to better meet students' needs within the time that they have in classroom periods, coaching sessions, and collaborative planning. From what I know about how each of your organizations works with technology, you each bring a strong stance about how that can also be used as a partner in specific targeted ways that are similarly focused on strengthening teaching and learning. And that feels important to name upfront given recent conversations about screen time. I'm excited to dive in. So let's start by grounding our conversation in the research. So, Julie, I'm going to invite you in. The evidence suggests that high quality coaching and feedback can meaningfully improve instruction, yet many educators report they don't receive these supports consistently. What does the research tell us about the challenge, and what have we learned from early evidence about how technology and AI can help improve professional learning and coaching?
Thanks so much for inviting me, Jess, and I'm really excited to talk about this really important topic. So, teaching is really complex and complicated work. And as you've kind of grounded us in this, like teachers' time is very limited. Teachers are working in isolation. They very rarely have opportunities to interact with colleagues with the kinds of frequency with which many educators really want. They have few chances to practice the kinds of skills they need to support kids, and they get pretty inconsistent and delayed feedback on their instruction, their relative strengths and needs. And they get even less kind of timely and actionable insight about kids and their strengths and needs and ways to connect the two. So how their instruction is influencing the ways in which kids are engaging in classrooms and the ways in which they're learning. So we know instructional coaching is really powerful as a tool, but it's expensive and hard to scale. And so for me, this feels like a really exciting time because AI-enabled tools can provide answers or mitigate some of these challenges that have been really intractable and made it really hard to get the kinds of leverage and improvement that we think teachers and kids deserve. So what do we know about how these tools are working to address these challenges? So next slide, please. So when we think about tools, I think about the goals of these tools in three kind of broad categories. One is teacher efficacy, whether or not AI-enabled tools help teachers feel better about their work. And that's really, really important because when teachers feel better, they're much likelier to stay. Whether or not these tools help teachers get better in terms of their instructional interaction, both what they report and what we can see when we watch them teach. And then three, in terms of the ways in which they're responsive to students, and whether or not these kinds of tools support not just teachers, but also in turn kids. And, I want to ground the conversation in the fact that there's been a lot more investment on student-facing tools and evidence about those tools than teacher-facing tools. So I want to talk about what we know and say from the outset, there's a lot that we don't know, which I know we'll come back to after we hear from the other panelists. So I think of the tools in four kind of broad categories. The first are classroom observations, where teachers are uploading videos of themselves or transcripts of their lessons that then get scored with NLP or Gen AI metrics. So again, trying to solve for this issue of delayed feedback. Teachers can learn very quickly about what they're doing and the kinds of relative strengths and weaknesses. I think we have early evidence that those kinds of insights can support teacher efficacy and instructional skill, but only if the teachers actually engage with them. And that's a pretty big if, because we also know that when teachers are time-strapped, they're much less likely to kind of take up or make sense of different kinds of insights about their instruction, especially if they're not scaffolded by a human in the building. So the second category is what I think of as kind of guided reflection with chatbots or other kinds of AI-enabled agents. And so again, as we said from the outset, teachers work in isolation. So having a kind of thought partner to think through the implications of your instructional decisions, to try to problem solve and think through how different approaches might better support students can be very, very powerful for teachers. And we know, I think pretty conclusively, that it does help teachers feel better, that they benefit and appreciate from having those kinds of conversations with an agent. I think we know less about whether or not those kinds of interactions influence instructional skill or responsiveness to students beyond what teachers say. And then my lab's been doing a lot of work on AI-driven simulations where teachers get to practice with simulated students, with avatar students. And we have a decade of evidence that those kinds of interactions support efficacy and skill, but only when they're coupled with coaching. And we've been using human coaches. So again, the question of scale is at the forefront. We have working prototypes of coach agents. So we're just beginning to build evidence about whether or not AI-driven simulations with AI-driven coaching can support skills in the ways that we hope that they will, and ultimately shift student outcomes. And then the final category, which a couple of our panelists I know are going to talk about, are about tools that give teachers more immediate insights about kids, about their work, about their learning. We have, I think, pretty compelling evidence that those tools help teachers, again, feel better and report that it helps them do their work in powerful ways and be more responsive to students. So I feel like a real researcher by saying that there is much less that we know about the kid piece, about the student outcomes, but I think we don't know very much about the ways in which these actually move the needle for kids. And to me, that should be the North Star of all of these conversations.
Thank you, Julie. I really appreciate your starting with grounding in what we know, under what conditions, and then some of the questions that we're still trying to figure out. And you led with talking about some of the challenges that exist in the profession with educators being stretched thin between different demands, planning, instruction, professional growth. Would love to invite in Sarah and Daisha, who I know your organizations are thinking about technology as a partner in helping educators focus more of their time in the work that matters most and simultaneously supports their own development. Could you speak a little bit about how each of your organizations is thinking about tech in that way? And maybe let's start with Sarah.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Thrilled to be here. Julie Cohen is one of my favorite researchers of all time. But simultaneously, it made me sad to see the challenges slide because I started my career in education as a high school science teacher, and all of the challenges on that slide are the same ones that I faced when I started teaching 20 years ago. But to add some hope to the conversation, what we do at Relay and Teaching Lab is we prepare and develop thousands of leaders and teachers across the nation, and we radically believe that all students can learn at the highest levels. We also run an innovation studio that we started about 3 years ago. And what makes us different in terms of innovation is that we work directly with the teachers and students that we serve to develop AI-enabled tools. And we refuse to scale those tools unless we can show that they have an impact. And then, really importantly, teachers actually want to use them. Another way that we think about this is we want to augment education and not automate things or just make the status quo more efficient. An analogy for this is the loom versus the crane. And so a loom automates a human task and makes it more efficient. And a crane allows humans to do things that they could never have imagined they could do before. So some examples are we have never been able to observe teachers every single day and give them feedback. We have never been able to get teachers to practice before every single time they teach and get expert feedback. We've never been able to give teachers immediate information on what their students know and what they should do with that information. So at Teaching Lab with teachers, we have developed two tools. I'll give you two examples. So one is an AI-enabled coach, and it's actually a human in the loop tool. So it takes expert coaches and it allows them to scale what they're doing to more teachers. We also have developed a teaching simulator, and this employs AI to provide feedback to teachers on anything that they want to practice. And what we also know from the evidence base in education is that the more you practice, the more you learn, and the faster you get better at your craft. So these are two examples of how we are actually employing AI in a very different way that builds on the evidence base of what we know about how to develop teachers, but also scales what we've never been able to scale before in education. And I'll pass it over to Daisha.
Thank you. I've had a chance to see Relay's teaching simulator. It is very promising, very exciting about where it's going. So I think to go back to the question of like how do we help teachers do what matters most? And we're all have been anchored already on what matters most is student learning. And so I think one of the superintendents that we work with shared a lesson at a conference last year and says, I don't have a technology strategy or an AI strategy. I have a teaching and learning strategy. And then I use tools or technology to help me advance that strategy. And so I think probably everybody who's attending this webinar is anchored on that. But I just think we need to constantly be coming back to like, what's required for student learning and what's required for teacher efficacy, and then how do we make those things easier? One thing I would say that's foundational, we focus on at Course Mojo on improving ELA achievement, specifically in grades 3 through 10. Like after you've done the good work on phonics fluency and phonemic awareness, then kids hit that comprehension wall. And unfortunately, in almost every data set, we see performance declining in terms of reading proficiency through middle school and into high school. So, what we go after, and I'll just talk about the student-facing side first, because I think what's very powerful about working directly with students is you not only can support them, but you then have the student work that can power a whole bunch of teacher insights that if you don't have visibility into, I think limits the ability to really keep the teacher efficacy grounded in student learning. So on the student side, I think the main thing is understanding cognitive science and what does it take for learning. And there's no getting around the fact you have to productively struggle. But the challenge is that while we've adopted these high quality instructional materials, which I'm a huge fan of, when I used to run schools, had a lot of people say to me, well, do you want me to teach the rigor of the curriculum or the kids in front of me? And we all know the answer is both, but it is hard. And with the diversity of learners in every classroom, what we would often see is teachers defaulting to whole class instruction. And what that means is they're generally getting 3 out of 27 students to answer any given question. And frankly, for the rest of those students, and there's evidence, teachers would tell you as well as research, the productive struggle becomes optional, and they do at least a lot less of it if they're not completely passive. And so part of what we've done at Course Mojo is we take the rigorous texts and tasks from the high quality instructional materials, and every student does the thinking in partners and small groups with that content, gets the at bat, gets feedback, and then again from cognitive science, what's actually most important is the act of revision. And sometimes we think that, oh, feedback is the great thing. And there's so many people who lead teacher training here. We know it's the redo after the feedback that gets you closer to encoding success. And so that needs to happen on the student side. And I would just encourage all the educators out there to really kick the tires on the product design and the student and teacher experience and ask yourself if it is leading to more and better thinking. Of course, the risk of AI and just the general access to the LLMs, it's having the opposite impact. It's actually leading to less thinking. How do we have purpose-built ed tech that does the opposite? To jump to the teacher side, our North Star, and this has come up already, I think a lot of folks are trying to save teachers time. I'm all for that. We should be saving teachers time. We do that. But really what we're trying to do is how do we help all teachers more easily execute the moves of effective teachers? And for us, we want teachers to be actively circulating when kids are working and figuring out what they know and what they don't know and then responding. The challenge is that's hard. You end up getting stuck on one side of the room. And so we do a live dashboard that shows teachers every student's level of understanding. They know immediately who needs their help and with what. Our favorite tool, the one that's used the most, is you push a button and it tells you the 2 biggest misconceptions in your class right now and suggests a discussion question. Teachers still conferences with the kid who is stuck, who's not getting there with their partner and the AI supports. Teachers still facilitates a full class discussion. Teachers still celebrates exemplary student work, but in all cases, they get just that little assist. So it's more likely to have these effective practices in all classrooms.
Thank you both. You're really connecting the dots for me in the practice piece for both adults and kids, how important it is to get multiple at bats, whether that's working on their own ELA instruction or for a teacher working on their practice. Let's turn to you, Kareem. I know your work also incorporates technology, but with a distinct emphasis on redesigning how daily instructional time is used. Where do you think schools are missing opportunities to make better use of class time? And what do you think becomes possible when we change that?
Yeah, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Jess. I think the first thing I'd say, and it kind of is a natural bridge from what Desha was talking about, but we're all here trying to scale innovation. But generally speaking, most classrooms actually look bizarrely similar to the way they did hundreds of years ago. And I think some of that's okay, actually. Like, I think the knee-jerk reaction is to be like, that's all wrong. It's not all wrong, but a good chunk of it is. And I think when you ask most teachers out there, are you able to meet the needs of the learner that's really far behind? Their answer is unequivocally no. I mean, even the best teachers in the game will say they just can't figure out how to do that well. Almost just as hard, if you ask most teachers, can you push the learners that are actually quite ahead? The answer is no. Which means in the current environment, the vast majority of students just really aren't actually appropriately challenged or supported in their tier one instructional block. And it's because it's nearly impossible to do that when you actually look at a more traditional framework of instruction. So then the question is like, what do you do about that? I think there's a lot of incredible tools out there that are enabling factors, and some of them do really good work, and many of them are sitting right here. And I've seen Course Mojo in action, and like it's awesome. I've seen the tools coming out of the teaching lab, and many of them are incredible. But I think part of the problem is educators don't actually understand what it means to change the way they use 60 minutes in a classroom, and it's not their fault at all. But we actually haven't provided a blueprint for that. So the way we think about it is if you're trying to effectively challenge a student who's academically quite ahead, or you're trying to address a student who's really academically behind, generally the resource that educators need the most is one-on-one and small group interactions. But doing that without actually having data to work off of is also kind of useless. So there's kind of two key resources that you need. You need data about the student's performance live in class, like what is literally going on and why do you need to be working with them. And you need the time unleashed to actually interact with them one-on-one in small groups. You kind of frequently will see a lot of tools out there that provide an enormous amount of data. Teachers don't use the vast majority of it, not because they don't want to, not because they're allergic to data. It's because they literally are like, thank you for the data, but my 60-minute block just kind of flows as this one whole group experience and then a tight opportunity for practice, and then we're gone. Like, what do I do with it? So part of what we think about is how can you structure a learning experience that still has some whole group experiences and elements, but then has the ability to release students in an environment where they have really structured work time such that the educator can repurpose their time for those one-on-one and small group interactions. These ideas have actually existed for some time, but the biggest fear most educators, principals, school systems will have is when that teacher is working one-on-one and in small groups with students, how do I ensure that the other kids are actually learning? That is the big fear. I actually think we would have shifted towards models like this much earlier if it wasn't for the fact that when you see this play out most of the time, you'll see three or four kids with a teacher and you'll go, that was really cool. But the other 20, like, I'm not really comfortable with what's going down. So let me revert back into this kind of one size fits all whole group experience because it feels less risky and problematic. So I think the biggest opportunity being lost at the moment is not really leaning in, given the amount of technology that's out there, the resources and the structures, to actually move across this continuum of a more dynamic learning environment where there's still whole group elements, there's still big discussion moments, but you also can really optimize for teachers looking at data live and then intervening and supporting students. But to do that, you need a really clear structure for how to run your classroom, and you need to have really thoughtful implementation of technology that isn't designed to just be like a thing you put kids on, but actually is supportive of that entire learning sequence.
Okay, now I planted some seeds that each of you were probably going to touch on. Are kids actually learning and how does instruction change? But all three of you hit that. So let's open it up to if we're looking at across technology, coaching, redesign instructional models, and use of class time, all of your work requires educators to adopt different ways of working. What have you learned from your experience working in schools and districts about the conditions that they need in place for those new approaches to actually improve teaching and learning? Maybe let's start with Kareem, since you began touching on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tough time to innovate. On one hand, there's all the tech craze, and then there's all the AI, and everyone's freaking out about innovation. But on the other hand, it's like a very reactive time. And being reactive is actually a disaster for innovation. I mean, you can just look at the tech backlash that we're watching live right now. When you overreact, to some big stories and big concerns, it creates a set of conditions where everyone ends up actually being frozen. You don't want to take risks. You're expecting things to just change back to the way they used to be eventually. Hard to feel like you can commit to new ideas 'cause you're eventually not going to be able to implement them. And frankly, if you go survey like 1,000 teachers right now, they all believe every initiative is completely fleeting, and they have good reason to believe that. So I think the biggest thing that you have to do in the most important set of conditions is actually as leaders to create environments where you can actually fail forward and you can commit to not being overly reactive. We are going to roll this initiative out. We expect a huge variability in implementation quality. We're going to have folks implement this badly. We're going to have folks that implement this pretty well, and we're going to have outstanding examples of this. We have to continuously learn and optimize through that. And during that process, there are going to be critiques from parents, kids, researchers. Maybe an article will pop out that says you're doing something wrong. Like that is part of the process. But I think right now we're in a space where the vast majority of folks are actually quite scared to kind of push back and kind of face that reaction. And what it does is it just maintains the status quo. And that's obviously not ideal. Outcomes can point to that. But without getting rid of the kind of reactive environment, it's very difficult to move interesting, compelling, and hopefully ideas that actually will move the needle for student outcomes.
I'll just jump in here and say, I think to build on what Kareem said, I think a big part of it is what are the big goals we're going after and how are those things that everybody cares about? In our case, we work with districts and schools. So I'm like, we want to improve ELA achievement. Specifically, once the good work's done in the elementary grades, like we're really struggling with middle school and early high school. So that's the point. The point is actually not the tech and innovation. It's what we're trying to go do, or what do we want? What are our vision and values for the student and teacher experience? Then I know some people hate pilots, but I actually think it's the right way to go with a lot of these efforts right now. It has to be a meaningful enough pilot that you're going to get real data, real teacher experience data, feedback from students and teachers. And there's a question I hope we come back to in the chat about parents, and then real outcomes data. So in a lot of our partners, they've started with between 500 and 1,000 kids. That's enough that you can even run a quasi-experimental matched comparison study. We now have our third, ESSA Tier 2 study, and you get real data. And then I think most people can get behind thoughtfully scaling something that has had demonstrated success in your context. And so I think part of what Kareem's getting at is there's am I in a survival mindset or an innovation mindset, innovation and excellence? But how do I get people there? And I think it's starting with something that we all care about as a community, a big goal or goals and some key values that we're going to make sure to preserve amidst any change we take on, and then testing it and rigorously evaluating it. And one thing that I think could help in this now is there are more and more outcomes-based contracts. And if people don't know, the Center for Outcomes-Based Contracting, OBC, you can find them on the web. They have tremendous resources. And I think that then can be the next step. Like we've seen a number of our partners start with a pilot, get early results, and then that's shared accountability. I mean, for those who don't know, half the contract value for the technology partner or whoever the partner is, tutoring, I think is where there's been the most action around OBCs, is actually contingent upon accomplishing goals, often individual student growth goals. So I think there are a variety of ways that leaders can manage the risk that Kareem's talking about.
And I can continue to build on this, Jessica, if that works for you. So what I say to my team is if we could bottle up and sell what would get 100% of students to learn to read at the highest levels, compute at the highest levels, graduate from high school ready to pursue their dreams, if we could bottle it up and scale it, we would just be doing that. But the truth is that we actually don't know the answer to that question. I was a trained scientist. And when you don't know the answer to a question, like how do we cure this type of cancer, you invest a lot in learning and research. So I think the best thing that a district leader and a school leader can do is invest in learning and research as well as the infrastructure to allow that to happen. And I think that's both technical and cultural. And I think some of the AI-enabled technology that we're developing also allows that to happen at a faster pace because you can collect data more quickly, you can analyze it more quickly, you can reflect it back to practitioners more quickly. Whereas when I was in the classroom, right, I was like sorting exit tickets and like analyzing them myself, and there weren't really strong data systems and things like this. So I think investing in the learning and research infrastructure is really important. And then I always get these questions about conditions. And I think we also need to understand that we can never wait for the perfect conditions in schools to improve teaching and learning. And really, the problem to solve uh, is the variability of conditions across schools. Teaching is complex. Students come in with variable learning needs. And so any new approach, any new model, like Kareem's modern classroom model, any new tool, it needs to integrate into a coherent plan that is led by a strong district leader and or a strong school leader.
Thank you. I think your point on things that we don't know the answer to and research infrastructure, I think is a good segue to bring Julie back in. Now that we've heard from the providers on the panel, what it makes you optimistic about where you see these approaches building on the evidence base, and then where do you see some of the biggest unanswered questions for the field?
Yeah, I want to start by saying that I do feel very excited, in part because I think that a lot of the panelists and a lot of people working in this space are eager for evidence. That everyone really does feel committed to trying to understand how their tools are supporting teachers and kids and in working together. It feels like a collaborative space in ways that I think are really powerful. So for me, there are a lot of open questions, in part around integration of tools. And I think that Kareem is right that a lot of school leaders are making kind of reactive choices around tools and not thinking strategically around how to integrate tools and the kinds of ways in which there could be tool overload. These tools are designed to mitigate cognitive and emotional load for teachers. That's
Froze briefly on my end. Someone nod if it, okay. Um, let's keep moving just for the interest of time. And if we have time, we'll come back to close out this section. But I
Oh,
do,
sorry,
oh,
I'm
hey, you're,
back.
okay, great.
This is what always happens. This is the tech challenge. But what I was also just going to say is that we need to understand much more as we build out the evidence base about how teachers and school leaders are making choices around tools in ways that are going to maximize the likelihood of having the intended outcomes. I just also want to say that there's been an investment in large data set building. And that a lot of those data sets don't foreground teachers to the degree to which I think that they should. And so that as we think about like open questions and being able to ask and answer the kinds of questions that I think everyone here wants to be able to ask and answer, a corresponding investment in linking insights about teachers to insights about kids, I think is going to get us much further than we've gotten thus far.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, let's do last lightning round question for Daisha, Sarah, and Kareem. If a school or district is considering adopting one of these approaches, what is one key question that leaders should ask? Let's start with Daisha for this one.
Based on the goals we care about, what do we know about the student and teacher experience has to be true in order for learning to take place, and use that to vet everything. And I think, by the way, the more clarity there is there, the more parents will get on board, because they'll understand the strategy and potentially contribute to it.
Sarah?
Yep. I love Daisha's question. And I feel like then the next question after that should be, does this feel like I'm adding another thing, or does it feel like it will lower the barrier to achieving excellence and coherence?
And mine would be, is the primary purpose of the solution to raise the floor of instruction or actually raise the ceiling?
So much wisdom. I'm writing these down and I'm going to ground these in my own thinking. Thank you all for being with us. I'm now going to welcome our second half, Mary, Brent, and Bryan, back into the discussion. So we just had a chance to explore how to better support educators within their roles. Now we want to ask more whether those roles and the way talent is organized across schools need to be redesigned more fundamentally, building on some of what you heard earlier about classrooms looking the same, teaching looking the same as for when some of us were in the classroom or went to school ourselves. Each year, about 1 in 7 public school teachers changes schools or leaves the profession. In 2026, more than half of teachers reported feeling burned out, and teachers continue to earn less than similarly educated professionals, often with limited opportunities to grow, lead, or earn more without leaving the classroom. Those challenges are raising real questions about whether our current staffing model is sustainable and how we can build on the expertise that's already within schools while providing more targeted support along educators' entire career trajectories. So in this next part, we'll explore what the evidence tells us about alternative staffing approaches and what becomes possible when schools redesign roles, teams, schedules, and compensation around the needs of students and educators. So let's start with the research again. Mary, for decades, schools have looked at staffing as a fixed and scarce resource in which teachers are expected to be experts in everything from curriculum design to multilingual learner supports and more, while operating mostly alone in a one teacher, one classroom model. Where does this model fall short in meeting the needs of today's students? And what evidence do we have about alternative approaches?
Thanks, Jess. So I'll start by saying there's a lot to say here. I'm going to limit myself to my allotted time, but what I'm doing for the most part is summarizing a report that goes through all of this evidence. So we'll make sure to drop a link to that in the chat so you can dig deeper if you'd like, but I'll hit the big pieces. So the first question is, where does the current model fall short? And three things kind of come up again and again when we look at the evidence on teachers' job design. The first is workload. Teachers are working in isolation. They have an unsustainable workload. Jeff mentioned this. One teacher is expected to be an expert on everything. And the evidence is clear that this is not working for teachers. You know, they always report high levels of job intrusion into their personal lives. They work significantly more hours than comparable workers. And it's failing students too. Students have increasingly varied needs. It's nearly impossible for one person to kind of be an expert in all the varied needs of students in one classroom. The second piece here is how teachers advance or have autonomy in their role. Teachers rarely are given opportunities to specialize or lead or grow. To advance in the career often means leaving the classroom and going into administration. And only about a quarter of teachers believe the profession offers real chances to grow. This is failing students. Again, it's promoting the best teachers out of the classroom. The better a teacher gets, the fewer children benefit, and that's completely backwards. We're essentially rewarding excellence by taking teachers further away from students. And the third, probably unsurprisingly for a lot of people here, is pay. Not just that pay is too low. I mean, I believe it is personally, but really right now it's disconnected from skill or expertise. We're kind of all familiar with this standard uniform salary schedule that just changes based on a teacher's years of experience or their degree. It's not tied to their role, it's not tied to their responsibility or increasing skill or expertise. So we know teachers believe this pay doesn't compare well to their peers. We know, again, we're not using pay to get the best teachers in front of the students that could most benefit. I want to emphasize that all three of these are really problems with the design of the job, not the people working in the job. And design problems can be solved with design solutions. So to go to the next slide, there are demonstrated ways to think about these roles differently. The first, in response to that workload concern, is thinking about collaboration or collaborative teaching models. This can look a lot of different ways. We might think of teams of educators sharing larger rosters, or more effective teachers being able to increase their reach to more students. Collaboration is often paired with the second piece here, differentiated roles. So in the differentiated roles, educators would be able to specialize and focus on what they do best, not asked to be the jack of all trades and in charge of every single aspect of a really complicated, broad job. Educators could also be invited to take on more leadership roles and advance without leaving the classroom and get those strongest teachers to stay working with children. In the third piece here, that pay disconnect could be solved by differentiated compensation. This isn't just merit pay, it's really paying for responsibilities or specialized roles and rewarding expertise. So again, we can go to the next slide. These are redesigns of the role that we now often talk about in strategic staffing, which is maybe a more recent terminology, but each of these specific components has decades of evidence behind it. So again, I'm summarizing many decades of research in a few bullet points, but collaborative teaching, teachers enjoy the ability to collaborate. They often ask for more opportunities. They demonstrate a stronger commitment to their schools when they're given the chance to work on teams. And importantly, it's connected to student outcomes too. So there's clear evidence that collaborative models can improve student outcomes. There's also some suggestion that the largest effects are for the most vulnerable students, so they can benefit more from small group or targeted instruction. For the second component here, differentiated roles, teachers regularly report enjoying the chance to specialize or having leadership opportunities. Specialized roles are tied to significantly higher retention rates, which again is important for students. And leadership is also consistently linked to improvements in student achievement. And the third piece here, differentiated compensation. There's a really strong evidence base that's growing right now showing that targeted bonuses, raises for hard to staff or specialized roles can significantly cut turnover concerns. And there's also evidence connecting differentiated compensation to student achievement, both long-term and short-term outcomes, including high school enrollment and on-time graduation. So this is, again, three separate evidence bases I tried to summarize in a few minutes. Each one is demonstrating some kind of link to student outcomes. And as I hand it back, we'll kind of get the opportunity to hear more about how those specific components might be combined in different ways.
Thank you, Mary. That was very impressive summarizing decades of evidence. I will do a short plug reminder that there's extra resources in the chat. So if you do want to go deeper on these, both on the research here as well as all of our panelists, make sure you're keeping an eye on the chat. And now we'll turn to Bryan and Brent. So we just heard Mary talk about some of the challenges with traditional classroom staffing, as well as how to think about designing a solution. Both of your organizations approach staffing differently. Tell us how they do that and what becomes possible when schools approach talent with more of the strategic student focus lens. And let's start with Bryan.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks, Jess, and the foundation for putting on this conversation. It's so imperative right now. And Mary, you're such a great researcher and synthesizer. You crystallized many of the challenges so well. And I would just add one more, which is as long as we stick to the one teacher, one classroom model, the chance that schools are going to deliver excellent teaching to all students is basically zero. And that's because it guarantees, by definition, that only about a quarter of students have teachers with a record of prior high learning growth for students. It's built in. And so what opportunity culture design is trying to do is flip those odds so that instead of just a quarter of students getting that great teaching, they all do. So how does that happen in these models? Well, the key is having teachers with a record of prior high growth leading instruction for grade and subject teams. So with revamped schedules so that they have time to lead and support their teams. Also, while they continue to teach part of the time, they're still teachers. We call this the multi-classroom leader role or the MCL role. And these are teachers that help their team prepare for and practice lessons based on the curriculum. They provide coaching and PD based on the curriculum and materials. They lead those data-driven cycles to improve and differentiate. They organize the time of the team to make sure all students get that one-on-one or small group tutoring that's aligned with classroom instruction. And importantly, they're fully accountable for the students served by the team. And then finally, they earn a substantial stipend, on average about 20% nationally, because of that big responsibility. And that's paid for by reallocating existing budgets, so it's sustainable. I would add that while the MCL role is central to this model, it's not just about the teacher leader. Team teachers and paraprofessionals on the team who directly reach more students can also earn more and have an advancement. And teacher apprentices and residents can learn on the job as part of these teams as well. So to harken back again to what Mary talked about, these designs are also transforming the daily work and career opportunities for educators. So teachers get more support. They have the chance to advance in their careers while continuing to do what they love, which is teach. Principals' roles change because they can focus on a team of leaders, not trying to directly manage all the teachers. And I guess the last thing I would say, and I'll turn it over to you, back to you, Jess, is that there's a set of principles that are based on a lot of research that schools design within when they're using opportunity culture models, but each district and each school tailors those designs to their needs. So it looks quite different from one place to the next based on the context.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to pass the mic to Brent because you can speak a little bit more about what's similar and what's different in the work that you're leading.
Thanks, Jess, and all. And the number of times that I get to follow Bryan Hassel in one of these sorts of conversations is many. And Bryan, just like huge, just debt of gratitude to the work and leadership that you and Opportunity Culture has sort of set in terms of this entire work around strategic staffing. Next Education Workforce, think of us as a center within the Mary Lou Fulton College for Teaching and Learning Innovation at Arizona State University. Work with about 50 school systems across 16 states, and have been at this now for 7, 8 years, and have learned a ton. And much of the model that we've got is similar to what Bryan just described. If I had to boil it down into a single equation, it would be get the same educators, a team of them, working with the same students during the same block of time. And of course, this is going to look different if you're working with, say, third grade students or ninth grade students. And the demands and the schedule and the educators and content area expertise is going to vary. And like Bryan just described, our models have a lot of variability into them that, with a set of core elements that are common across all of those models. Things, though, that we are ensuring are that teachers have adequate planning time, and that they can lean into their particular areas of strength. It creates new roles. And so what kind of does teaming, what does it enable? Well, I think that it enables access to the right or best educators for the particular student at the particular time, allowing us, and I'm using that word educator really intentionally. This isn't a single person sport, but rather it is a team of educators with many different skills, and allowing us, Bryan often talks about the multi-classroom leader, this idea of having a person, on every team that has demonstrated expertise. We lean into that as well, but probably not as formally as Bryan and Opportunity Culture do. It just depends on the particular context in which we're working. That we are really interested in making the job more doable for educators, especially novice educators. And the moment that you liberate yourself from the one teacher, one classroom model, what you are able to do is shift responsibilities and really strategic. We talk about strategic school staffing. How do we put more of the strategy into strategic school staffing? And some of that is making sure that the roles and responsibilities that people are asked of are commensurate with their training, their expertise, and what they can deliver on. And so let's set educators up for success. And then finally, I think these team-based models allow educators and leaders to respond to whatever the next challenge happens to be. And we heard about challenges with instruction or differentiation. It could be declining enrollment, or it could be, God forbid, a pandemic, right? What we have found is that when you liberate yourself from the one teacher, one classroom model, your ability to modify and adjust goes up a whole lot. And we can talk more about that and some of the results that we're getting in a minute.
Thank you both. You're really making me think about how much just workforce design and how humans work in teams can really be applied to ways in which schools haven't necessarily evolved in the same way that we have in other professions. I'd love to connect this back to some of what Mary led us in terms of the evidence. What are some of the evidence or indicators of impact on educator and student outcomes that convinced you that these models and staffing designs are improving teaching and learning? What are the conditions that show you that a school or district is ready to adopt one of these approaches? And maybe let's start with Brent for this one.
Yeah, great. Well, most of my career, the first half of it at least, was in educator preparation and thinking about could we tighten the screws on educator preparation and ensure that people were wildly prepared for the job, the very complex job that was before them. And I would continue to invest in educator preparation, in creating doable jobs. But there was something about the working conditions into which we were placing new teachers that I just couldn't shake. And so as we've built the next education workforce, we've unapologetically held to focus in terms of our outcomes that are both educator outcomes and student outcomes, and that our theory of action goes something like when you change the outcomes for educators, retention, their efficacy, their ability to collaborate and work together, the fact that they can show up and be happy or go to the bathroom when they want, like all of these things contribute to a more satisfied and effective workforce. And then, if you have those conditions, we should then see differences in student outcomes. And one thing that I'm sure Mary and others will talk about is how are we defining success, both for educators and for students, and that what is sometimes easy to measure is not the whole story. And right, we can all do better on this particular point. And that what we have found relative to our educator outcomes, and this is where we have been focused for again, unapologetically for the first bit of our work, is that we're seeing, we just had a causal study that was released. It's there in the chat. We're seeing improvements, and this is causal evidence, increases in educator retention, increases in educator evaluation scores. This is even controlling for prior evaluation. So working in a team-based model improves the chances that you will return to work next year in the same school, and that you will be more effective as an educator. The exciting causal results that we just saw were increases of 2 to 3 months worth of additional growth in math achievement. And in the other grades and subjects in this causal study were a little more ambiguous. And Mary Lasky, who is actually one of the authors on this study, can say more about this, or we can nerd out at Stats Camp. But it turns out that the data systems that we have built, and many of the systems we have built, are all architected around a one teacher, one classroom model. And it makes it really hard, I think Kareem was saying this, to associate educators and the particular students, and especially the nested nature of the data. We are seeing lots of other non-causal data, things like improved collaboration among educators, feeling more supported, feeling like they're more likely to recommend the profession or request fewer substitutes. All of this is correlational, but positive and trending. And on the student side, fewer disciplinary referrals, an increased number of students performing at grade level, and there's an intersection with instruction and curriculum here, fewer ninth grade failures. And if you wanted to know about a readiness question associated with all of this work, one, you have to be willing to disrupt the one teacher, one classroom model. And two, you need to be able to have a different schedule that allows educators, same kids, same educators, same block of time. And please make sure that you've got planning time for your educators. Otherwise, this turns to dust. I think, Bryan, it's over to you.
That's a good overview, Brandon. I just really appreciate your, attention to evidence and putting it out there for the world, and also, how much you've done to convene people interested in this topic through your summit and other means, because we really have a lot to talk about and a lot to improve on as a field. So really appreciate that. As far as results that we're seeing, I guess I would point to 3 indicators. So one is in the Opportunity Culture Initiative, 99% of the teacher leaders and more than 90% of the other team members want the models to continue in their schools. So that's according to an annual anonymous survey that we do of about 3,500 educators, more than 3,500. And so the teachers love working in these models, and we see that translating into real impact. For example, in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and Ector, Texas, districts have seen 75 to 90% reductions in vacancies as a result of implementing these models. And like Brent said, that's a key step in this process, is the teachers being in a better place. But then number 2, I'd move on to the student learning growth. We've seen nearly an extra half year of learning growth annually for students served by these teams in third-party studies, a couple of them averaging across those studies. Another way to look at those same findings, kind of more on the teacher side, is that when teachers join these teams, they are typical range of teacher effectiveness. Once they join the teams, their effectiveness jumps up to the 77th percentile on average, if you average across these 2 studies and the subjects. And so the models make top quartile teaching the norm rather than the exception. And that's really important to see. And then the third fact I would put out there is that we see 2 to 3 times the rate of school-wide high growth learning in state accountability systems when schools have these models. And critically, when they meet a set of standards for implementation that make up the opportunity culture certification system. So, for example, schools that are Title I that are not using these models in the states where we work, 21% of them make high growth in their state accountability system. But schools that meet those certification standards, at least at a basic level, 45% of the Title I schools in opportunity culture models are getting high growth. So it's it's over doubling the rate of high growth, and it triples the rate of high growth if 100% of the kids are reached by these models, which isn't always the case. So we're seeing school-wide high growth come out of this. And critically, though, it is among schools that are meeting a small number of implementation standards, things like selecting teacher leaders based on prior high growth, things like giving them the time that they need to lead, paying them well within existing budgets, and a few others. We don't see the same high results when schools aren't meeting these standards. We don't see the same high results when schools try to DIY this without the standards framework in place to go for. And that's why it's so important to keep an eye on not just kind of do these models work, quote unquote, but rather what works? What are people doing in schools? What's leading to the results that they're seeing? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you both. I want to make sure we save a little bit of time for Q&A, so I'm going to ask my last questions briefly to each of you. Mary, as you're looking across the evidence base, what questions do researchers and practitioners still need to explore?
I'll go quickly here because Brent and Bryan set me up perfectly, and I didn't even pay them to do that. The first thing is thinking more about variation in effects. So the evidence base is still emerging, and much of the work now is really binary, kind of out of necessity. So what that means is we're comparing folks who are doing something to folks who are not, and that gets us this average effect, which is important and is the right first question, but it's necessarily kind of treating all implementation as the same. And we know that we're working with real human beings in the real world and real context, and things look different in different places. So thinking more about variation and how effects look different in different places, I think is a real frontier here. Relatedly, we have these average effects, but we know less about the specific components that are driving those effects. And that's related to that variation piece, right? You might think about that. This is like a mechanisms push or why we're finding the effects we are. So a lot of these models have multiple different components that are working together. And it's important to know which parts of these are kind of non-negotiables and which parts we can flex more. And this is really practically important as we think about expanding and scaling further. I could go on and on about like 100 other research questions I want to ask. I won't do that. But the third thing I'll push on, and I was really happy that our colleagues in part one talked about this too, is just we need to keep researching this and we need the data to keep researching this. So I'd end with kind of a push to think about how we're tracking this information, how we're structuring our data systems so we can keep learning. We can't wait until we have the right evidence to act. We have students in schools now that could be benefiting, and we need to kind of work together to make sure we are learning together.
Appreciate that call to action. And my last question is for you, Bryan and Brent, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. For school and district leaders who might be considering this work, what do you think are the most important questions that they should ask or look for to understand whether or not this type of effort is on the right track?
I would say the most important question to ask is, are the initiatives that you're taking on, which are huge, and it's an understatement of the year to say there's a lot on your plate, are these initiatives more likely to succeed if teachers are working largely alone and with probably very light support from the principal and overstretched coaches that they have, and only a fraction of your best teachers are reaching, only a fraction of your kids are being reached by great teachers? Or are they more likely to succeed if teachers are on teams led by teachers who have a prior track record? And I think the key to this question is, the reason why it's so important is it can help you avoid what I think is a common trap, which is to think, yes, this all sounds really convincing, Bryan, but I can't do this right now because I'm really busy improving literacy in my school. So let me get that done first, and then let's talk. But the truth is, those initiatives, whether they're literacy, math, whatever they are going to be much more likely to succeed and critically be sustainable within your school staff, within your school budget over time, after the grant is gone, after the state line item fades, if you build this into your school structure right now rather than waiting. So that's the question I think is most important to put on folks' radars for the moment.
Unsurprisingly, I agree with Bryan. I see the remainder of my time to Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you. And I'm going to invite back everyone from the first part of the panel to join us all together. We'll answer some questions for the audience. A couple of you have already had questions shared at the Q&A. If you have others that are coming up, please feel free to do that. We'll answer as many as we can live. And thank you again to those of you who submitted ahead of time. Okay, so why don't we start with, it looks like we have a question around backlash against technology in the classroom. How do you bring in families as partners to technology adoption in schools to help ensure successful implementation? Anyone want to jump in on this one?
I'm happy to chime in. I do think a lot of times families are just legitimately confused because they don't get a robust amount of information about how classrooms work. I mean, if you look back to the COVID era of like teaching through a screen, suddenly parents are like, whoa, is this how school works? Now, it isn't really how school works. That was a really kind of unpleasant version of how school works. But part of what did happen is a lot of visibility into what was going on in classrooms. So I do think, certainly in modern classrooms, we actually prepare a fair amount of resources for teachers that is essentially like what you send home to parents to just be super explicit about what it is that you would expect a kid to be doing in one of our classrooms. And also be explicit, almost like when we train teachers to anticipate misconceptions, there will be misconceptions. Like a classic one in modern classrooms, because we sometimes use instructional videos, is my teacher's not teaching me. Right? That's like a thing you'll sometimes hear. I'm sure you see this with other, like my teacher doesn't teach me, the computer does, right? And if that were true, then this would be a disastrous solution. So like getting ahead of those fundamental questions, I think also matter. It's equally important to prep principals. I found that principals in particular are often the folks that ultimately like go to their office and someone's knocking on their door being like, we got to talk, and ensuring they also have the clear understanding and talking points around this matter. I found that it's really, really important to separate concerns from families that are actually about ineffective implementation and concerns from families that are actually about a true misunderstanding of what's going on. And honoring both matters, but the moment you just put all of them in the category of you're wrong is just a bad move because a lot of times they're right. And what they're engaging with is just poor implementation, which happens.
Thank you. Okay, I got to jump to another question unless anyone feels burning desire for that one. So please use your body language and or raised hand to jump in. So our next question is from Anne. How can we ensure that educators utilize AI without losing their comprehension integrity for delivery? I might call on Daisha for this.
Yeah,
Okay, because
if I understand what's meant by comprehension integrity, I think there is a real risk. I think we're all familiar with the risk on the student side of outsourcing or automating thinking with AI. I think there's an equal risk with teachers. And so in product design, we very much try to tee up choices for teachers, both because we know they're going to have access to real-time information that no tool would have, and more importantly, good judgment. And we very clearly sending the message, you are still every bit as in charge as you were before this tool existed. And so I think that's important, both in the way tools are introduced to teachers and how they're implemented. And then I guess I would just say one other thing that's come up repeatedly. We need to, Sarah talked a lot about coherence. And Kareem talked about, yes, we want to move away from some of the stuff that's happened in the past, but we know a lot about how the brain works, how we all learn. We know a lot about effective teaching practice. And fundamentally, we have a giant execution challenge with like just making it happen on a daily basis for kids and teachers. And so in a variety of ways, it's less that we're talking about something new and more we're talking about a better way to actually deliver I spent a lot of time in high quality instructional materials. It calls for jigsaws and small groups and full group discussions. And like, it doesn't lack for complexity of like a beautiful vision of what we have to be happening. And this is about how do we actually do that? How do we leverage this technology and these staffing models to actually make that happen for more kids and teachers?
simplifying in the face of a lot of complexity. Maybe you mentioned staffing models. Let's turn to one of the questions specifically about our second portion. So Nicole and Alexis asked questions about how do we increase demand for strategic staffing and innovation during a time of fiscal uncertainty? And is policy a barrier? And are your organizations doing anything to address that? Brent or Bryan, does one of you want to take this one?
You're off mute, Bryan. Go for it.
Yeah, the policy is the key to creating demand. I think states are an essential player here to, which they've done on many other areas like HQIM, to say, here's some incentives and or inducements and some support to move away from the one teacher, one classroom model towards research-based models that are going to get you in a better place to implement the great initiatives that you're trying to implement. This could be either a standalone policy that says we're incentivizing this, like we've seen in North Carolina and New Mexico, or it could be embedded in bigger initiatives that states are undertaking, like their literacy moves or their math moves, where they could say we're putting better math instruction in place, in part by helping schools put these structures in place that'll help them implement what's trying to the goals of these literacy and math initiatives.
I'd echo all of that, and I would add that sometimes seeing it in action is just really helpful. Changing the hearts and minds of people, and this is hearts and minds work in some ways, right? We're challenging the traditional grammars of schooling. So one of the things that we've done is create these site visits. I know that Bryan has done the same, where in partnership with local schools and districts, invite people in from across the country and world to see the work in action and to be able to not talk to us, like talk to the educators, talk to the kids that are learning in these environments. That to me feels like a way to move this forward and to invite people like our state policymakers or our state legislators into the models too, to see this work in action.
That's great. Thank you both. You touched on policy as key to creating demand. We have another question about policy from Mecca about what do the panelists advise as the most productive policy levers specifically to elevate teacher effectiveness?
I'm happy to jump. Yeah. So all of this work is about humans. And the best way that you get students to learn more is you invest in developmental opportunities for humans. So we need to invest in teacher coaching. We need to invest in leadership development. We need to make that super coherent with the pipeline development. We need to make it super coherent with the way teachers are prepared in undergrad and in graduate schools. And within certain places, they have done this. And if you read about the Mississippi Miracle, or some people call it the Mississippi Marathon, you see that. You see this intense investment made through policy to unlock resources for evidence-based human development. This intersects with the conversation around AI tools because, like Daisha said, the goal is not to say that now that we have technology, you don't need to engage in that human development. We actually need it more than ever, but technology can help scale the expertise that you need in order to make that happen for every single student and every single teacher. And I'll add one more thing. We've had a lot of conversations about like barriers to innovation or barriers to adoption. But when I go out and talk to public school leaders, public district leaders, they all want the opportunity to do something new. But what they're often afraid of are the sort of policy barriers or sort of like their boss's boss and what they're being told to do by some larger kind of system. I think we also need policies that free up the innovators. And then again, we need to pair that sort of freeing up and freedom to try something new with data and evidence collection so that we can ensure that we're then not, scaling something that's new but also bad.
So I just want to echo everything Sarah said and just add a couple of specific things that I think states could do with policy that would make it easier for us to understand much more about the ways in which both strategic staffing and tools and other professional development kinds of opportunities promoting the kinds of outcomes we want. So one, states could require measures of instructional quality that are systematically collected in the ways in which we know they need to be collected to understand what teachers are doing. So that's much more than one 15-minute walkthrough a year. Schools need resources to be able to do that. That's expensive work, but it's really, really important. And states could do a lot on that front. States could require that schools and districts require collecting information about PL and about the ways in which teachers are working together in strategic staffing or other kinds of models in schools. And three, this would be icing in my mind, but that as schools are introducing new HQIM tech tools, other kinds of tools that are designed to kind of mitigate these pervasive challenges that we've all been talking about, that we also collect systematic information about those that are layered into data about kids and kid learning. And to the point that everyone's making here, if states require it and incentivize it, it's much likelier to happen.
And I would just say on the AI tools front, we desperately need an ed reports for vetting ed tech tools. They are flooding into schools, and it's on school districts, each of them, 14,000 of them, to figure this thing out. And I think Delaware is creating an AI assurances lab. I think in the absence of federal leadership, states could step in here and vet for safety, efficacy, and ultimately outcomes.
Thank you. Those are all great pushes, duly noted, and we'll want to dig into more of this with each of you afterward too. Let's turn to that. We have a question around the research front that I think also gets at this pace of innovation with the number of tech tools that are coming in. So with so many innovations that are emerging every single day, Trisha asked, how will research keep up with practice?
I'm excited for Julie to answer this question, but I'll talk a little bit. It's outside the scope of what I thought I'd talk about today, but I really do think there's a role for AI and how we approach research differently and make the research process quicker and more efficient. So that includes getting data more regularly, being able to analyze it more regularly, and kind of speeding up that process and make things more accessible. There's like the researcher aspect of that, which I'm familiar with. I think there's a structural component that we're still figuring out of like how journals are dealing with getting way more submissions and how we're reviewing that and making sure that the evidence is strong is something we need to think more clearly about. But I do think we there's the same reason there's so many innovations emerging. We can use some of those same tools to also study those innovations as well.
And I just want to say two more quick things, which is that there is a new working paper, I forget where it is, from Megan McCormick at Overdeck and Stacey Alicia at Ripple about the need for new research models around AI tools. And I think it's really, really important and amplifies the point Mary's making about the pace of peer review and the ways in which academic work doesn't necessarily incentivize the kinds of quick insights and answers that the field really, really needs right now. And so as an academic and a career academic, I feel like I also want to say to the research community that we need to figure out kinds of new solutions so that, new assistant professors feel like there's, an incentive for them to work alongside AI tool developers to really be able to study things much more quickly and to be able to share out with the field what they're learning in ways that currently are not aligned with the nature of academic work.
Thank you both. We have time for one last question. This one is from Divya. We could see all of these awesome solutions and models are having real implications for the master schedule. What do you know about how schools and districts are tackling that component? Anyone can jump in here.
Bryan's probably going to say he and I actually have a meeting later this afternoon to talk to a master scheduling provider about this very question. This is super real. And there are a lot of traditional grammar school schooling that are just baked into the way things have always been done. And so we need people, district leaders, and others to question some of those long-held assumptions and to be able to try new things and to create the conditions to de-risk it for individual schools or individual leaders to try some new things out. And there are systematic ways that we can do this. There are always some unintended consequences here that we need to be super mindful of. And Bryan, anyone else add to this, please?
Well, you look like you're about to say something, but I don't want to call you in if not.
That was a great answer. This is critical to all of this. Both panels, time is of the essence in more ways than one.
Well, we will close with that. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. I hope you feel as energized by this conversation as I do. If you'd like to reach out to any of our panelists, their contact information is up on the slide. We'll also share that in an email along with the recording from today. If you'd like to stay up to date on all the news from our foundation, you can subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on LinkedIn. And finally, you'll see a quick survey pop up as you exit the webinar. We use your feedback to shape all of our future content, so please thank you in advance for sharing your thoughts. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.